Hello, everyone, and welcome back to HRE Insights in 30, the podcast where we explore the real world challenges that are shaping risk management, compliance, and of course, we can never forget about operational resilience. Now, this is especially important for fintechs, banks, and other high risk financial businesses. I'm your host, Justin Muscolino, CEO of High Risk Education, where we train fintechs, banks, and risk teams on AML, fraud, sanctions, crypto oversight, and a lot more. So today I am joined by Branan Cooper, a pretty seasoned executive and operational risk leader with, a number of decades of hands-on experience across financial services, technology, and customer operations. Now, Branan has held leadership roles at some pretty big organizations, such as ABNA America, Comcast, Bridgeforce, Bancorp Bank, and more. And he's also a very recognized speaker, advisor, and industry expert on operational risk, regulatory compliance, third-party risk, and more than I could possibly imagine even at this age of my career. So, Brandon, after that long introduction, I want to welcome you today.
Well, thank you very much, Justin. I appreciate you inviting me, and I really admire and respect a lot of the work that high risk education is doing in bringing a lot of attention and much needed education in the areas of fraud and sanctions, AML, third party risk, et cetera. So it's great to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are the lucky ones. So, let's kick this off. I really want to know a little bit about your background, like your career path. You've had a pretty long and diverse career across financial services, ops, tax. What lessons from, those early years kind of help shape how you think about operational risk and also governance today?
Terrific question. And it's interesting because I joined the financial services industry without really even intending to right out of college. I had heard that the financial services industry is a great place to learn about all areas of business and to get to experience a lot of it without actually having to kind of, be your own entrepreneur business self. So I was very fortunate to join a small credit card company at that time that grew to be literally the largest independent credit card issuer. That was MBNA America. And I joined early on and was part of a management development program. So I got exposure to all the different operating areas at different points, everything from the credit area to collections and over to marketing. Moved down to Atlanta for a couple of years and ran our telemarketing center down there, and then back to our consumer finance and business lending areas. And just gradually over time, my career took me more and more toward the areas of risk management and compliance. And that's really where I've focused the latter half of my career. I stayed at MBNA for about 18 years until we were acquired by Bank of America. Then I had the really interesting opportunity to be part of the early integration team, helping to merge MBNA, which was a Fortune 200 company, into Bank of America, the nation's largest bank at the time. And that was, quite an eye opener. It was a lot of experience, but it was also a huge challenge. It taught me, and goes back to your question, really things that I needed to know pretty early on. First, finding that opportunity to strike a balance between risk and reward. MBNA was growing like a weed. And that was good for us on one hand, but at the same time, when you're growing that fast, you really need to respect the guardrails and ask yourself, are we built for scale? And are we doing things today that are going to set us up for success in the future? And again, as I learned later, there are times where we make quick snap decisions in the interest of chasing a result that come back to haunt us later. Fortunately, we had a very good control environment at MBNA, but it reminded me early on that we really need to respect that at all times. I would also say it taught me to hire well, invest in talent if at all possible. Look for people who can help you to grow the business, but do so responsibly, as we've talked about. Fortunately, I don't think anybody grows up saying, "Hey, I want to be a compliance officer." At least, God, I hope not. Um, I sure didn't ever think my career would lead me to compliance and risk management. But I found that it's a great area to, really work a lot of the expertise that you gained along the way. I also learned early on to ask pertinent questions. If you don't understand something, ask. The worst thing you can do is be silent and let something pass you by that you don't understand and then get pulled right back into that situation later and not know what to do. You never know what you're going to learn if if you don't ask the right question about it. And then finally, maintain contacts. That's one of the things that I think has gotten so much easier in recent years, thanks to LinkedIn and all the other social media that's out there. I've re-engaged with people all the way back to high school, I guess, probably. But more importantly, MBNA grew from about 1,400 people when I got there to 28,000 when I left, I believe. So, we were a small town, so to speak. I'm still, connected to probably, I would guess, 1,000 or so of them on LinkedIn. And just last year, we had a really nice reunion with 700 or 800 of us here in the Delaware area. And it just shows the power of that connectivity. If I needed help today on a particular compliance or risk management, or really any other issue, I can still reach back to a lot of the leaders that I learned or I met in the MBNA days. So I hope that answers the question.
No, that definitely answers the question. No, I appreciate it. And you touched upon numerous points that are invaluable. The relationship management, not burning bridges and, things like that. People just don't realize how important they really are till later in their career. But, you think about what relationships could do for you and your career and for your work. And,
Hmm.
there's way too many positives to overlook. But, sir, you mentioned one thing on operational risk, which I do really want to touch on. So, you've worked in a couple different areas. You've been in marketing, ops, technology, enterprise risk. All those aren't very common for one person to be in all of them. But from your perspective, where do organizations most often underestimate, operational risks, especially in fintech and like those high growth environments?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the last part of your question. That is, in the fintech and high growth areas, it is so tempting to chase the, shiny new object that's out there. We've got this great idea. We've got a ton of cash, terrific venture capital. We think this is, building the better mousetrap and the world's going to beat a path to it. That's all great. But do you have the right, legal analysis to back it up? Do you have the right compliance rigor? To do it? And do you have, a sustainable infrastructure to build on? So often we see companies, grow astronomically, but then all of a sudden find that they've run out of growth room, they've run out of capital, they've run out of good ideas. They've encountered a compliance problem. They don't have the right team in place, and they're not prepared for, what they've signed up for. I think for mature organizations, it's usually a little bit different. They decide to stray away from their core concepts and core values. And we even saw this at times in the MBNA days where we had to kind of talk ourselves out of or redefine our purpose and get back to, the core principles of what we were all about. If you stray from those and you try to go too far out on a limb and too far in the wrong direction, you're going to find that you're outside your area of expertise. And quickly, a lot of the processes you've built just may not be applicable. Another problem I see quite often is underestimating what you need to know about the industry. It seems really exciting to get into something like right now. Let's use the easy example of the OCC and FDIC and others offering up opportunities to get into the more traditional banking system from being a fintech and from being a startup. That sounds great, but it comes with a lot of hurdles. And I don't think a lot of people anticipate what's going to be involved in doing that. And that's where you really do have to engage outside expertise to get you to where you need to be, onto a good, solid compliance footing. From an operational risk standpoint, clearly you need to think through all the different areas. And operational risk isn't as simple as thinking about, okay, I've got a call center. What does that mean? There are a lot of embedded consequences in that. I mean, risk management in a call center, let's just use that as a pretty straightforward example. You've still got to think about things like human resources because what are our hiring practices? Do we do background checks on these folks? Do we have a clean desk policy, which of course trickles over into other areas like compliance risk. So, what sort of education do we do with the new hires to make sure they're up to speed on the various regulations and know what they can say and can't say to customers? So, it seems like a easy operational risk challenge to solve often has tentacles all throughout the organization. So when you ask about areas that can be underestimated, it's really sort of an amalgamation of all those. It's looking at the opportunity for startup, looking at the opportunity for growth, looking at sustainability, looking at resilience in the case of problems, looking at how do we go and continue to grow the organization in a responsible manner. And then finally, when problems do occur, and they will somewhere down the road, problems are going to occur. How prepared are we to deal with them and deal with them in a responsible manner? Is it going to be a panic reaction, which I've seen way too many times, or is it going to be a controlled response of we anticipated this could happen. Let's look back and see what the playbook was that we put together and address it in an organized and appropriate manner.
Yeah, that was a good answer, Brandon. We have to think of what happens when we repeat the same thing over and
Whoa,
over
yeah.
again and expect different results, right?
Yep.
I think it's about time we kind of do things differently, but not just say the word. I can't believe I'm going to say this word, proactive. But
Right.
I think we got to put that into our culture a little bit more. Um, but that was cool. Like what I want to touch on with you, and you kind of alluded a little bit to it early on, the tech side, right?
Hmm.
We it plays a huge role in modern risk management. From the automation side to the system integrations and dealing with all those third-party platforms. So, how should organizations really think about risk ownership when tech enables, processes, but doesn't control them end to end? Which, again, what are the confines they need to operate within? So, how would you handle?
I think it all starts with the governance structure, honestly. And I know that sounds way too ivory towerish or that sort of thing, but it's true. I mean, if you can put together early on in the creation of the company or at some formative point in the company's growth, a really good program that says, here's how we're going to consider new business initiatives, or here's how we're going to consider adding new third parties. If you can define that really well and describe that it's everybody's job in the company, of course, to think about compliance and risk management. It goes without saying, hopefully in today's culture. But you really need to be able to set that tone from the top of here's what the board expects, here's how we expect senior management to enable it, and here's how we encourage or expect cooperation from all the different business areas. So technology may own it or may own the vendor relationship, but it really takes input from the operational area. Certainly, it's going to take input from the compliance area and making sure they've thought through what regulations or consumer protection standards come into play. It's going to take participation from the audit area to check on that from time to time. It's certainly going to take investment from the finance area and making sure that we've really thought through what are the implications and are we going to incur expenses we didn't think about. It looked like a cheap investment to start with, but we're having to hire a lot of people to support that technology initiative. And all of a sudden, the cost model that we built for it goes upside down. So it really does mean that you need to think not only in terms of what does technology bring to the table, but how are we controlling it, to your point, from end to end? Where does it start? Where does it stop? And even more importantly, in some cases, where does the customer data go? In today's environment, where so much of it is outsourced, so much of it is sent overseas, you've got to really think about, okay, what are our controls and what's the oversight that we're maintaining? You can do that in a variety of ways. It's by having a really good third-party risk management program, developing appropriate oversight and employing some of the tools that are out there in the industry to do ongoing monitoring. In some cases, it might require a site visit, which is kind of cool if you're outsourcing overseas, I suppose. I've
Yeah.
been to all 50 states and a bunch of countries, and it's mainly been for work. And that's kind of nice to think about. But you really do need to have the sort of that hands-on discipline to managing it. And then really thinking about the exit strategy as well. If something goes irreparably wrong, how do we get out of this relationship without harming the consumer or at least minimizing the impact to the consumer? It's important to think those things through even at that formative stage of taking on new technology. I often describe it as when you get onto an airplane, what's the first thing that you do? You sit down, you put your luggage away, and then you think about where are the exits and listen to that safety briefing and hear about the worst case scenario. You don't want to think about that. You want to think about, I want to sit back, relax, and enjoy my flight. And somebody's lecturing to me about, how to get off the aircraft safely. That's what you need to take the same discipline to in considering new technology. Go into it expecting the best and wanting to be able to have a nice, happy travel through this technology relationship. But at the same time, know where the exits are and be ready to use them if needed. So I don't mean to be doom and gloom about it, but at the same time, you need to think about it all the way through. So great.
No, I like that analogy. Yeah, that was spot on. All right. So one of the things that you were getting to, the third party risk and vendor dependency, I want to get into that because, there's a lot of fintechs that rely heavily on vendors, platforms, and, outsource operations. So, like, based on your experience, what kind of separates those effective third party risk programs from ones that are just the opposite, a tick the box exercise that, you know, we don't really want to go down that path.
I have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of third-party risk management. That's sort of been my subspecialty probably for about 15 years now. And I do see that real error a lot of times of the check the box mentality. Let's use due diligence as probably the most straightforward example. I gather all the required documentation. I check it off the list. I literally say, okay, I've got their Secretary of State report. I've got their, SOC report. I've got their financial report. Good, got it all, put it in a file, forget about it until a problem occurs in some cases, or the next exam, or we need to change something. And then we look back and there's something that should have been a smoking gun all along that we just simply didn't see because we didn't take the time to review it. It happens. I know it happens. I've been a part of that. I've made that mistake more than once. I've stubbed my toe where I'm under such pressure to get this vendor signed, or we're already doing business with the vendor. I found out about them after the fact. I'm rushing to get it approved by risk committee. And in doing so, I hustle through the due diligence and I cut a couple of corners. And lo and behold, it comes back to haunt me down the road. It happens so often, it's scary. So I think the first thing is making sure that you have a really well-defined process for third-party risk management. That starts again with some sort of documentation saying, here's what we expect, educating the various business areas on here's how to go about selecting a new third party. Here's when your compliance or risk management team needs to be involved with it. Here's how we're going to do due diligence in a very organized fashion, giving us plenty of lead time to ask questions if needed or to follow up on missing items. And then when that due diligence comes in, to do the appropriate analysis. If I don't have that financial risk expert on my team, I need to have somebody, a subject matter expert in the organization I can reach out to, or a compliance officer to reach out to on the policies and procedures. I need to be able to, go through and assess what's the risk initially of us doing business with them, what we call the inherent risk. As you walk in the door, what strikes you in the face as being the biggest risks associated with this third party? Document it. That's your inherent risk. When you think about, okay, how do we take care of those risks? How do we lessen them? That's called risk mitigation. Pretty simple. Document that. What procedures are you going to take to make sure that you have controls around those risks? Let's say it's an easy one, like a financial risk. Okay, we've got financial exposure by dealing with this third party. How do we address that? Do we need to set aside an additional reserve? Do we need to have some sort of clawback in the contract if things go wrong? Do we need to staff more people into it? In which case, all these things are financial considerations. But they're also risk mitigants that we can do to lower the inherent risk of doing business with the organization. I described a moment ago that inherent risk is what you see when you walk through the door. By the time you've defined all the risk and the appropriate mitigation standards, that level of risk you're left with is called your residual risk. Again, you want to score it objectively, but You've walked in the room seeing one level of risk. Hopefully, by the time you're leaving the room, you're seeing a different level of risk. And then you need to maintain that risk assessment. It isn't just a static one-time document. When something happens, when policies change, when there's a problem, when you decide you need to, renegotiate the contract, or just when the contract's coming up for renewal, revisit that risk assessment. Ideally, if it's a high risk or critical vendor for you, you want to revisit it at least on an annual basis because things are going to change on a regular basis with somebody like that, somebody who's got access to your customer or your customer's data. You also, that begs the question of how do I do that? And that's by having effective ongoing monitoring. And whether it's reviewing regular business reports, whether it's meeting with the vendor on a regular basis, whether it's watching for some alarming social media about them, all of those are things you need to be doing to maintain the appropriate oversight of the vendor before problems happen. And one area that I think people forget about or tend to fall asleep on are consumer complaints. It's easy once you're off to the races with a great new marketing company to say, "Hey, we're doing great. We're booking lots of new accounts." But then you start hearing customer complaints. Is that a tip of an iceberg, or are you getting ready to crash the entire Titanic? A good way to do that is to look at the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's consumer complaints database. It's public facing. And one of the reasons I always suggest that is because the CFPB uses that as a gold mine for their enforcement action investigations. They're looking at their own data and saying, wow, that company seems to get a lot of complaints that seems too high a rate of complaints for a company similar to it. If you aren't watching out for that sort of stuff, it's going to bite you. We've seen several enforcement actions that truly just found their origin right out of that complaints database. And then finally, contract management standards. You need to have appropriate contracts in place, whether that means the right service level agreements, whether it means the rights to audit, the ways in which you can declare a material breach of the contract. You need to think through all those things. And one area that I often see overlooked with great peril, again, are exit strategies. It's great to be able to document, here's what we're going to do if a problem occurs, but are you really prepared to do it? So document an exit strategy. And here's a pro tip. Test that exit strategy on a regular basis. It's one thing to have it, written down somewhere. It's yet another to be ready to operationalize it when it happens. Do people know what to do, or do they run like their hair is on fire and start calling all the executives around the organization in some hectic, frantic manner? And I've seen that happen, and I've actually seen it cause a couple companies to go down because they, overreacted or, reacted highly inappropriately to a situation. So all of that said, you need a very robust third-party risk management program that's built, again, to consider everything from the smallest uh, third-party initiative that you're bringing on. So a new uh, cleaner of the facilities that you're working in. Sounds silly, but remember, those guys have after hours access to your facility. So what are their hiring standards? Do they have some way of getting access to confidential material or seeing information they shouldn't? Sounds crazy. To the very robust, here's a new core processor. Just think of all the questions you need to ask them. So you need to have a process that addresses all of that in a very controlled and organized manner.
Thanks, Brandon. I've been waiting for this day that we had you on our podcast, and the day has come. I really appreciate it. It's only taken a few years, but I'm so happy we did. Um, Listen, Brandon, thank you so much for, your thoughtful and, your typical grounded conversation. As you mentioned, operational risk isn't a single function. It's really, a result of how people, processes, tech, and third parties kind of work together. So big thank you to you for joining us on HRE Insights in 30. And to our listeners, this episode really does capture exactly what this podcast is about. Learning from practitioners who have done that, been there, who have built, scaled, and managed. So thanks for tuning in. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and take care.